Hey everyone, welcome to Conflict Tales. Get ready for another unbelievable story filled with drama and unexpected twists. Homeowner Association just sent me a letter claiming that my land is part of their community, despite the fact that I never signed up for anything. They demand that I pay fees, follow their rules, and, worst of all, they want me to tear down my house. The problem? I own this land outright. It's mine, legally purchased fair and square, and I am not backing down. I moved here 2 years ago, after winning a decent sum in the lottery. Nothing life-changing, but enough to buy a piece of land on the outskirts of a quiet town. I wasn't looking for luxury, just peace. So I picked a spacious plot at the edge of the woods, far from the manicured lawns and matching mailboxes of the suburban developments. I built a modest home, set up a small workshop, and enjoyed the solitude. Until Homeowner Association came knocking. It started with a letter taped to my front door. Dear homeowner, your property has been reassigned under the jurisdiction of Pinecrest Homeowner Association. You are required to adhere to community guidelines, including landscaping, exterior aesthetics, and homeowner fees. The paper listed an obscene amount of rules, including mandatory lawn maintenance schedules, an approved color palette for houses, and a prohibition on non-conforming structures. Apparently, my home and workshop didn't fit their pristine vision. I ignored the letter. A week later, another arrived, this time certified mail. Homeowner Association demanded a meeting. I called them up, and that's when I first met Karen Fisher, the Homeowner Association president, a woman in her 50s with an expensive haircut and an attitude to match. She spoke to me like I was some unruly tenant instead of a landowner. You need to understand, she said, our community thrives on uniformity and order. Your property is an eyesore. I kept my voice level. I never agreed to be part of any homeowner association. My property wasn't listed under it when I bought it. You have no authority over me. Karen gave me a tight-lipped smile. Oh, but we do. The City Council approved the annexation of your land into Pinecrest Homeowner Association's jurisdiction. It's official. My stomach twisted. I hadn't received any notices about this. No warnings, no votes. Just, bam. My land was now under their control? That sounds like something I should have been informed about, I said. She gave a little shrug, the kind that said, too bad for you. You can challenge it, of course, but in the meantime, you're expected to comply. That means fees, structure changes, and removing any unsanctioned buildings. Unsanctioned buildings, that was my house and workshop. I told her where she could stick her homeowner association rules and hung up. That's when the real harassment began. First, I got slapped with violation notices. My fence was too tall. My driveway was gravel instead of concrete. My house was painted in an unapproved color. Then, my trash service mysteriously stopped picking up. Calls to the waste management company went unanswered. Then came the fines, outrageous amounts for nonsense infractions. I ignored them. That's when the anonymous complaints started flooding the local code enforcement office. Within days, an inspector showed up, citing me for structural violations. When I demanded to see the records showing my land had been annexed into homeowner association jurisdiction, he mumbled something about pending documentation and drove off. That night, someone cut the lock on my workshop and trashed the inside. Tools scattered, cabinets broken open, shelves overturned. No cameras, no witnesses, no proof. The sheriff took a report but said it looked like random vandalism. Then the worst happened. One morning, I stepped outside and found orange construction stakes driven into the ground across my yard. A sign stood near my driveway. Future Development Zone. Pinecrest Homeowner Association. I stormed into the Homeowner Association office. Karen was sitting behind her desk, flipping through a binder. She didn't even look up when I entered. Ah, Mr. Cole, she said, feigning surprise. I assume you're here to discuss the transition. I threw the sign onto her desk. What the hell is this? Karen finally met my gaze, her smile too pleasant. It's exactly what it says. There's been a proposal to develop higher-value properties in this area. The homeowner association is working closely with city planners to make this community even more desirable. Your property, as it stands, is not aligned with that vision. You're trying to steal my land." Her smile widened. "It's nothing personal. It's just business." That was when I realized. This wasn't just about rules or appearances. This was about money. A lot of it. They wanted me gone so they could sell my land to developers. And if I didn't leave willingly, they were going to make my life hell until I had no choice but to sell. I took a deep breath, locking eyes with Karen. "You're making a mistake." She gave a small laugh. "Oh, Mr. Cole, we'll see about that." That was the moment I knew. I wasn't just dealing with a petty homeowner association. I was up against something bigger, something dirtier. They wanted a fight? Fine. I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The next morning, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Pinecrest Homeowner Association, demanding that I halt any modifications to my property. That was ironic, considering I hadn't modified a thing. It also included a deadline, 2 weeks, to voluntarily comply with their demands. If I didn't, they would initiate legal proceedings. The wording was aggressive, almost threatening, as if they expected me to fold without question. I spent the next hour flipping through every document I had on my property purchase. Nowhere did it mention Pinecrest Homeowner Association, annexation, or any future claims to my land. I called the title company, demanding answers, but all they could tell me was that the records had shown no homeowner association involvement at the time of my purchase. That didn't explain how they suddenly had legal rights over me. I drove down to City Hall. I needed to confirm what Karen had told me, that my land had somehow been absorbed into the homeowner association's jurisdiction. After an hour of waiting, a tired-looking clerk pulled up the records. According to city documents, Pinecrest Homeowner Association had filed an annexation request 6 months ago. The city council had approved it, but there had been no public notice, no notification to property owners, no votes. Just a few signatures and a stamp. "That doesn't sound legal," I said, leaning over the counter. "They can just add my land without my consent?" The clerk frowned, flipping through the pages. "Usually, a landowner has to sign an agreement before annexation. But—" He hesitated, scanning the page. "It says here the previous owner had signed an agreement allowing potential future annexation if the city expanded homeowner association boundaries." My jaw clenched. I had bought this property fair and square. There had been no mention of any homeowner association when I signed my papers. Who was the previous owner? The clerk pulled another file. A holding company, Stonebridge Investments. I had never heard of them, but something about it felt off. And the city council just let this happen? The clerk sighed. They're pressured by development projects all the time. Homeowner associations work with investors, realtors, politicians. It's all tied together. You could challenge it, but you'd need a lawyer and a strong case. That was exactly what I intended to do. On my way home, I stopped by the bar where Tyler worked. He poured me a drink before I even asked. "You look like you're ready to punch a hole in the wall. They filed for annexation months ago. The city just rubber-stamped it." I took a sip, feeling my frustration boil over. The kicker? The previous owner was some company I've never heard of. Stonebridge Investments. Tyler let out a low whistle. "That's bad news. Stonebridge is tied up with real estate developers. I guarantee you this was planned long before you moved in." My stomach dropped. That explained the sudden interest in my land. The homeowner association wasn't acting alone. They were just the middlemen. Someone higher up had their eyes on my property, and they had manipulated the system to get it. I pulled out my phone and started digging. Stonebridge Investments wasn't some small-time operation. They had connections with multiple large-scale real estate projects, many of them tied to urban development initiatives. A deeper search revealed lawsuits, claims of fraudulent land grabs, coercion tactics, and backroom deals with local government officials. A few hours later, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Mr. Cole? Who's asking? My name is Rachel Carver. I'm a real estate agent representing a private buyer interested in your property. I almost laughed. You're kidding me. Not at all, she said smoothly. My client is willing to offer you a very generous sum to vacate within the next 30 days, more than fair market value. I clenched my teeth, and if I say no? A pause. Then, in that same neutral tone, I strongly suggest you consider the offer. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, gripping the phone. This wasn't just about an homeowner association dispute anymore. Someone with real power wanted my land, and they weren't going to play fair. I had just become a target. That night, I heard a noise outside. Not an animal, something deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The wind rustled through the trees, but the air felt too still, too charged. I swept the beam of light across my yard. Nothing. Just as I was about to head back inside, I spotted them. Small orange flags, barely visible in the moonlight, planted in neat rows along the edges of my land. Survey markers. They were planning something. The next morning, I found a second letter in my mailbox. This time, it wasn't from the homeowner association. It was from the city planning office. They were scheduling a zoning review for my property, something that only happened when land was being considered for development. I clenched my fists. They weren't going to stop. They were escalating, pushing me toward a corner. But they underestimated me. If they wanted a war, I was ready to fight. The morning after receiving the zoning review notice, I drove straight to City Hall determined to put an end to this madness. The clerk at the front desk recognized me instantly. Her polite smile faltered when I approached. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully. "How can I help you?" I placed the letter on the counter. "I need to speak with whoever authorized this. My property is not up for review, and I'd like to know why the city thinks it is." She took the letter and scanned it before hesitating. "This isn't something that comes directly from the city. The request was submitted by a third party." My jaw clenched. "Let me guess. Pinecrest Homeowner Association?" She gave me a tight-lipped nod. "They filed the request under the premise of community redevelopment and aesthetic consistency." I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my anger in check. "Who do I need to talk to?" She hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. "You can schedule a meeting with the Planning Commission, but I should warn you, those decisions are heavily influenced by community stakeholders." I didn't have to ask who those stakeholders were. The homeowner association had its claws deep in the city government. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about how much power they had. I walked out of City Hall feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. These people weren't playing fair. They weren't just trying to harass me. They were trying to force me out through every legal and bureaucratic loophole they could find. I made a mental note to start recording everything. If this turned into a legal battle, I needed evidence. That evening, I heard movement outside my house again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, but instead of prowlers or survey markers, I found a man standing by my fence, arms crossed. He was tall, mid-40s, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit the rustic surroundings. His posture was too confident, his demeanor too composed for someone who was just passing by. "Mr. Cole," he greeted me, his voice smooth and practiced. "My name is Ronald Smith. I represent a group of investors who are very interested in this area." I didn't lower my flashlight. "And?" He gestured toward my house. "We're prepared to make you a substantial offer for your property. More than what the market dictates." I narrowed my eyes. "You mean more than what your buddies at the homeowner association have already offered?" A small smile played on his lips. "The homeowner association serves a purpose, but their methods are limited. My clients have bigger plans." I stepped closer. "And if I say no?" His smile didn't waver. "Then you'll continue to face increasing challenges. Zoning complications, utility issues, legal disputes, all very costly, all very time-consuming." I let that sit for a moment, measuring the weight behind his words. This sounds an awful lot like a threat. Not a threat, he corrected, a prediction. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. Get off my property. His smile faded just a little, but he gave a slight nod and turned to leave. Think it over, Mr. Cole. The sooner you accept, the easier this will be. I watched him walk off into the night, my heart pounding. This was bigger than the homeowner association. This was about power, influence, and money, and I had just told them I wasn't going anywhere. That night, I sat at my desk, scanning through every document I could find about Pinecrest Homeowner Association and Stonebridge Investments. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Stonebridge had a history of quietly acquiring land through pressure tactics, then flipping properties for massive profit. In multiple cities, property owners had been forced out, their land rezoned, and their homes demolished for high-end developments. This wasn't a new strategy. It was a perfected one. A few hours later, another call came through, a different unknown number. This time, I let it ring. The voicemail that followed was chilling. Mr. Cole, I strongly advise you to reconsider your stance. Fighting this will only make it harder for you. I gritted my teeth. They weren't even pretending anymore. I decided to make my own moves. The next morning, I met with a lawyer, a sharp woman named Lisa Greer who specialized in property disputes. She listened carefully, then leaned forward, eyes sharp. They're trying to wear you down. The zoning request is just the beginning. If you don't comply, they'll escalate. We need to find something solid that can block them. Lisa instructed me to gather every piece of documentation, record interactions, and start looking for any irregularities in the homeowner association's dealings. I left her office feeling more prepared, but also fully aware of what lay ahead. This wasn't just a fight for my land. This was a battle against an entire system designed to push people like me out. The pressure was mounting, and I could feel it with every passing day. My morning coffee had turned into a ritual of skimming through legal documents, zoning laws, and any paperwork I could get my hands on that might help me fight back. Lisa had connected me with a real estate consultant, a guy named Greg Parsons, who specialized in uncovering shady land deals. He arrived at my property late that afternoon, a thick binder tucked under his arm and a look of curiosity in his eyes. You weren't kidding when you said they're coming for you, he said, flipping through some documents. Stonebridge Investments has a pattern. They operate in the shadows, work through intermediaries, and by the time people realize what's happening, they've already been forced out. I crossed my arms, watching as he pulled out a map. So, what's their endgame? Greg pointed to several highlighted plots on the map, all neighboring my property. They've already acquired a good chunk of the surrounding land. The homeowner association is just a tool to clear the rest. Once they get your property, they'll push for a zoning change, clear everything out, and sell it off in parcels to luxury home developers. I exhaled sharply, my suspicion now a confirmed reality. And the city just lets this happen? Greg sighed, shaking his head. City officials don't ask questions when money is involved. The homeowner association provides a convenient excuse. Once you're gone, they'll justify the development as community improvement and make it seem like it was inevitable. A creeping sense of dread settled in. These people weren't just coming after me with fines and legal notices. They had an entire system backing them. My options were dwindling, and I knew that unless I found something substantial, I'd be looking at an uphill battle. That night, I got another call from an unknown number. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. Cole, I answered. You're making this harder than it needs to be, the voice on the other end said. It was calm, almost too polite. We're giving you another chance to make the right decision. The offer is still on the table. I clenched my jaw, and if I refuse? A brief silence, then a chuckle. Then things will continue getting complicated for you. The line went dead and I slammed the phone down onto the counter. 2 hours later, my electricity went out. I stood in my darkened kitchen, staring out at the dim silhouettes beyond my property. The street lights were still on, the houses across the way still glowing with light. This wasn't an outage. This was targeted. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside and walked around to my electrical panel. The lock had been snapped clean off, The breaker switch deliberately flipped. I turned it back on, my fingers tightening around the flashlight as I scanned the area for any movement. A rustle in the bushes, a shadow shifting in the distance. By the time I stepped forward, whoever it was had already disappeared. I called the power company first thing in the morning, demanding answers. They claimed there had been no reported outages and that any service disruptions on private property weren't their responsibility. Of course, Lisa wasn't surprised when I told her about the latest stunt. "They're testing you," she said, her voice clipped. "Seeing how much you'll tolerate before you crack. We need to find something on them first." Greg came through later that day. He handed me a flash drive and a thick folder. I dug into Stonebridge and their connections with Pinecrest Homeowner Association. You're not the first person they've pulled this on. They've been quietly acquiring properties through coercion for years, always using the Homeowner Association as their first line of attack. I flipped through the pages, my anger growing with each revelation. Manipulated zoning changes, forged community petitions, legal loopholes exploited to push people out of their homes, and right there, buried in one of the reports, was a name I hadn't expected: Ronald Smith, the same smooth-talking investor who had shown up at my fence days earlier. "They're moving fast," Greg warned. "I'd bet they're already pushing for an emergency hearing to finalize the zoning change. If they get that, your legal options become a lot slimmer." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. Then we have to stop them before that happens. I didn't have all the pieces yet, but I had enough to know one thing for sure. I was done playing defense. It was time to fight back. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of an engine idling just outside my driveway. I peered out the window and saw a black SUV parked across the street, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. They weren't trying to be discreet anymore. This was intimidation, plain and simple. I grabbed my phone and snapped a few pictures. Lisa had warned me this might escalate, but seeing it play out in real time made my stomach tighten. I didn't bother calling the cops. They'd either show up too late or chalk it up to a misunderstanding. Instead, I texted Greg and Lisa, letting them know we had company. An hour later, I met Greg at a diner outside of town. He looked exhausted, but his expression sharpened when I showed him the pictures. "They're getting bolder," he muttered. "That means they're running out of patience." I took a sip of coffee, the bitterness settling against the frustration gnawing at me. Lisa said they might try an emergency hearing to push the zoning change through. If that happens, I lose any leverage I have. Greg nodded grimly. "That's exactly what's happening. I pulled records this morning. They've petitioned for a closed-session hearing with the city council. If it gets approved, the decision will be made before you even have a chance to fight it." I exhaled through my nose, gripping my mug. "Then we have to stop it." Lisa arrived a few minutes later, her usual composed demeanor slightly frayed. She dropped a folder onto the table. "They made a mistake." I flipped open the file, scanning the documents inside. "What am I looking at?" "A transfer of ownership," she said. "Pinecrest Homeowner Association filed for annexation of your property 6 months ago, but there's a clause in the city's zoning code that requires at least 75% of affected residents to approve any homeowner association expansion. The problem is, your land was never zoned as residential. It was classified under mixed use due to the workshop you built." Greg's eyes lit up. "That means they couldn't legally annex it in the first place." Lisa smirked. "Exactly." The weight on my chest lifted slightly. Finally, something I could use against them. "How do we leverage this?" Lisa leaned forward. "We go public. You've been playing defense this entire time, waiting for them to make a move. Now we expose what they've been doing." I considered it. I hated media attention, but at this point I had no choice. If we could turn this into a public scandal before the city council meeting, we might have a shot at stopping them. Greg drummed his fingers on the table. "I have a contact at the local news station. If we give them the right angle, big developer conspiring with homeowner association to force out homeowners, we can make this explode." Lisa nodded. "We also need to get this in front of the city council before they approve the hearing. If we prove the annexation was fraudulent, they'll have no choice but to revoke it." I clenched my jaw. Then let's do it. The next 24 hours were a blur of calls, emails, and meetings. Greg's contact at the news station agreed to run the story, and by the evening broadcast it was already making waves. Lisa compiled every legal document, every shady transaction, and sent it to the city's legal department. By the time I arrived at the city council building the next morning, the pressure was already mounting. Protesters had gathered outside, holding signs demanding transparency. The mayor looked like he hadn't slept, and several council members were already avoiding eye contact. Karen Fisher, the head of the homeowner association, sat at the far end of the room, her expression a mask of controlled rage. Next to her, Ronald Smith, the smooth-talking investor, was doing his best to appear unaffected. But I could see it in his posture. He knew they had been caught. The hearing was brief. With the evidence presented, the council had no choice but to acknowledge the zoning violation. The annexation was officially revoked, and Pinecrest Homeowner Association was placed under investigation for unethical land acquisitions. Karen stormed out before the meeting ended. Ronald lingered, watching me with a cold expression. As he passed, he muttered under his breath, "You have no idea what you just disrupted." I met his gaze, my voice steady. "Try me." By the time I got home, the SUV was gone. My land was mine again, and I knew that, for the first time since this fight started, I had won.